Hi again. I want to talk to you today about the Order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is only mentioned sparingly in the Bible, and he's mentioned as being the priest of the Most High God. And we can kind of tell what Melchizedek is all about by what is told to us in the book of Hebrews about him. But we're going to just take a full look at what the Bible says about the Order of Melchizedek. The first mention of Melchizedek is in Genesis chapter 14. As we mentioned last week when we looked at the tithe, we saw the story of how Abraham defeated Chedorlaomer and returned all the goods of Sodom. And we see in verse 17, the king of Sodom went out to meet Abraham after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer and of the kings that were with him. And then verse 18 says, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. He was the priest of the Most High God. Now, this is the only mention of Melchizedek up until now. And it's kind of vague, really. It just says that he was the priest of the Most High God. In verse 19, we see that Melchizedek blessed Abraham and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abraham gave Melchizedek a tithe of all the spoils that he brought back. So Melchizedek was the priest of the Most High God, and Abraham gave him an offering. He gave him an offering that was a tenth of all the spoils of war. Notice Abraham, like I pointed out last week, Abraham did not give Melchizedek anything of his own. He gave him a tenth of the spoils. But as is pointed out in Hebrews, the lesser is blessed by the greater. And it's Melchizedek who blessed Abraham. He blessed Abraham and said, Blessed be Abraham of the Most High God. So Melchizedek was the greater between him and Abraham. But we're told the most by the fact that Melchizedek was the priest of the Most High God. And we see also in Psalms chapter 110, talking about Jesus, it says in verse 4, the Lord has sworn and will not repent. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So this is talking about Jesus, we know, because this reference in verse 1 was talking about Jesus. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And then it mentions how Jesus is the one who carries out the wrath of God on the day of the Lord, and how he will judge among the heathen. So this is obviously Jesus Christ. And it says that he is a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So we know that Melchizedek was the priest of the Most High God, and that Jesus is a priest forever in the order, after the order of Melchizedek. So we see this explained in a greater measure in Hebrews, but it's important to see in Hebrews chapter 8, the truth of heaven, what it's like in heaven, and how Melchizedek is the priest of the real temple in heaven. In Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 1, it says, Now of the things we have spoken of this sum, we have such a high priest. It's talking about a high priest who can come before God, who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. We know that Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father, and this is talking about Jesus Christ. He is the high priest that's spoken of here. Verse 2 says, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle. Remember, the priesthood of Aaron was in a tabernacle which was a shadow of the real one. It wasn't the real tabernacle. Jesus is a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord has pitched, and not man. So man made the tabernacle that was overseen by the Levitical priesthood. But this is talking about the sanctuary which the Lord has pitched, and not man. And then verse 3, for every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices, even the Levitical priesthood. They were ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices. Wherefore it is of a necessity that this man have something to offer. For if he were on earth, he would not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law. So it's making it clear here that Jesus is not of the order of the Levitical priesthood, because they offer gifts, and they still were offering gifts when this book of Hebrews was written. They were still offering gifts at the altar in the temple that was a copy of the temple in heaven. Verse 5, who serve unto the example and shadow of the heavenly things. In other words, the temple on earth was a shadow of the heavenly things. Talking about those who serve at the temple that was in existence when the book of Hebrews was written. Remember, the temple had not been destroyed yet when the book of Hebrews was written. As Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. For see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern shown to you on the mount. In other words, Moses was told what the real tabernacle would look like, and he was supposed to make a copy of it. He was supposed to make all things according to the pattern of that real temple in heaven. Verse 6, but now has he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is a mediator of a better covenant, which is established upon better promises. So here we see that Jesus has a more excellent ministry than the Levitical priesthood, because he's the mediator of a better covenant based on better promises. So we can see here that there is a temple in heaven. There's a temple in heaven that is the actual temple. And Jesus, when he rose from the dead, he became this high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So it only stands to reason that Melchizedek was the original priest in the temple. And Jesus is in the same order as Melchizedek. Now in chapter 2 and verse 14, it says, forasmuch then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also, talking about Jesus, he likewise took part of the same. In other words, he became flesh and blood, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is the devil. We know that had there is not past tense, that's present tense. Him who has the power of death, that is the devil. If you watch my video on physical and spiritual death, I point out, if you look at the original Greek here, this is present tense. Satan is the one who has the power of physical death. That's the devil. He's the one who holds it. But the important thing to see here is that as the children, the people are the partakers of flesh and blood, so Jesus himself took part of the same, flesh and blood, in other words, that he might deliver those who through the fear of death all their lifetime were in subject to bondage. Verse 16, for verily he took not on him the nature of angels, but he took on him the seed of Abraham. In other words, Jesus became flesh of a human woman. Mary was his mother, so he actually was a partaker of flesh and blood. He was legitimately half human and half God. And then verse 17, wherefore in all things it behooved Jesus to be made like unto his brethren. So he had to be made like unto a man, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself has suffered, being tempted, and he is able to succor them that are tempted. Now this is kind of vague in the King James. I'm going to bring this up in the NIV here. Starting at verse 17, for this reason he had to be made like his brothers in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people, because he himself suffered when he was tempted. He is able to help those who are being tempted. So we see here that Jesus is a high priest, and he's a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God. Now, if we move on to chapter 4, we see starting at verse 14, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. So here we see that it's Jesus Christ who is this great high priest who has gone through the heavens. That's Jesus, the Son of God. And since we have this great high priest, we need to hold firmly to our faith, the faith we speak, we profess. And then verse 15, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. And then that's why verse 16 is so important. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Now, why can we approach the throne of grace with confidence? because Jesus is a high priest who took on flesh and was human just like us. He is able to sympathize with our weaknesses. He was tempted and yet was without sin. He was tempted in every way just as we are. But because he was half man and half God, he overcame and he was without sin. He overcame in every circumstance. And he makes atonement. Remember, it said he makes atonement for our sins. Since he's our great high priest, we can find grace. And we can approach the throne of grace with confidence, and we can receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Now, if we move on to chapter 6, starting at verse 16, I'm going to continue in the NIV here because it's easier to understand. It basically says the same thing as the King James. Verse 16, men swear by someone greater than themselves, and the oath confirms what is said and puts an end to all argument. Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath. Now we are the heirs with Jesus Christ, according to the Bible. So verse 18, God did this so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope offered to us may be greatly encouraged. And then verse 19, we have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain where Jesus, who went before us, has entered on our behalf. So this tells us something very important. Jesus Christ has entered the inner sanctuary, the sanctuary in heaven, behind the curtain. Jesus went before us. He has entered into the sanctuary. He has become a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Now that tells us that before Jesus, it was Melchizedek who was the high priest in the temple in heaven. In chapter 7, verse 1, it says, this Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. Now, people think because he was the king of Salem that he was a man. But it plainly tells us Melchizedek was not a man. And Salem is never mentioned as a city on earth. So this brings a new perspective to this sentence. This Melchizedek was the king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. Now, Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, and Jesus went into the Holy of Holies, into the sanctuary in heaven, behind the curtain. That's the Holy of Holies. He went in behind the curtain. Jesus did that, and he is in the order of Melchizedek. And here we see that Melchizedek was the priest of the Most High God. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. That's the story we read originally in Genesis chapter 14. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, his name means king of righteousness. Then also king of Salem means king of peace. So here we see that king of Salem doesn't mean the king of a city. It means king of peace. So king of Salem here means king of peace. Melchizedek was the king of peace and the priest of the Most High God. And then it goes on to describe Melchizedek in verse 3, without father or mother, without genealogy. Now this tells us plainly that Melchizedek was not of mankind. He was not of the descendancy of Adam and Eve. He was without father or mother, without genealogy. That means God created Melchizedek. He was created by God, much like Satan was originally created by God. And Satan fell away because he had free will and he fell away from God. Well, Melchizedek didn't fall away. He is without father or mother, without genealogy. In other words, he was created by God directly. And he's without beginning of days or end of life. Like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. So here we see that Melchizedek is still a priest of the Most High God. Melchizedek was the king of Salem, and that means the king of peace, and priest of the Most High God. And we see that he remains a priest forever. So Melchizedek is a priest of the Most High God forever. And he's without beginning of days or end of life. In other words, he's never going to die. Verse 4, just think how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. So we see that Melchizedek came down in human form, came down in appearance of a man, but he was not a man. He was not of the descendancy of Adam and Eve, because he was without father or mother, without genealogy. To be of the descendancy of Adam and Eve, you have to have a father or mother. You have to be of a genealogy. Melchizedek was neither. He was created by God, and he was a priest of the Most High God. Just think of how great he was. In verse 4, even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. So here we see that Abraham did not give him a tenth of anything he had. He gave him a tenth of the plunder, as I pointed out last week. Verse 5, now the law requires that the descendants of Levi, who also become priests, they have to collect a tenth from the people. That's the tithe. Now, we know the law was given to the Israelites, and no other nation on earth had the tithe given to them. Only the Israelites had the law. The law was given to the Israelites as part of the covenant God made with Israel. And only the priests in the order of Levi ever received a tithe. The tithe was only for Israel, and only the Levites ever received it. So the Levites here, it points out that those priests, those Levites, they collected a tithe from the people of Israel. That is, their brothers. Even though their brothers are descended from Abraham. Now, we know Abraham was a man, and we know that his descendants were all mankind. And the Levites were of mankind, and their priesthood was imperfect. And that's why there had to be a new priesthood under Jesus Christ. Verse 6. This man, Melchizedek, however, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. So here we see that Melchizedek was greater than the Levitical priesthood. He was a priest of the Most High God in the actual temple, the temple that is in heaven. He was an actual priest of the Most High God. So he was greater. And the Levitical priesthood was not even in place yet when Abraham gave a tithe of the spoils to Melchizedek. Notice Abraham did not give a tenth of anything he had. This was nothing to do with the tithe that the Levites received. This is a totally different tithe that Abraham gave. Abraham gave a tithe. He gave a tenth of the spoils to Melchizedek. So it just kind of shows you the difference between the priesthoods here. So we see that Melchizedek did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth of the spoils that Abraham won from defeating Chedorlaomer. He collected a tenth of the spoils from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Abraham had the promises, and Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. He blessed Abraham. Verse 7, and without doubt, the lesser person is blessed by the greater. In other words, Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. Verse 8, in the one case, the tenth is collected by men who die, but in the other case, by him who is declared to be living. So here we see that the tenth collected by men who die is talking about the Levitical priesthood. And I pointed this out last week. The Levites were, at the time Hebrews was written, they were still collecting a tenth. So in the one case, the tenth is collected by men who die, by the Levites, and it still was being collected at the time that Hebrews was written. And in the other case, what's the other case? The other case is Melchizedek. Verse 6 says that Melchizedek collected a tenth from Abraham. So the other case is talking about not Jesus, but Melchizedek. And this is where a lot of people get screwed up. They think that Jesus receives tithes in heaven. It doesn't say that. It says in the one case, the tenth is collected by men who die, talking about the Levites. They collected a tenth. And then in the other case, in the case of Melchizedek, by him who is declared to be living. Yes, Melchizedek is declared to be living. Why? It says in verse 3 that Melchizedek is without father and mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. That means he is declared to be living. So verse 8 is talking about the Levites and Melchizedek. It's not talking about Jesus. I've heard preachers try to say that this is talking about receiving a tithe in heaven from Christians. It's not talking about that at all. First of all, it's talking about the Levitical priesthood here, about the priests who receive the tithe. That was only the Levites. The Levites are the only people who ever received tithes. No one else ever received tithes. Melchizedek was not of mankind, and he received a tithe that was not even Abraham. Abraham didn't give him anything that belonged to himself. Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of the spoils that he won in defeating Chedorlaomer. So it was not a parallel of the Levitical priesthood receiving a tithe of everything Israel had. So in the one case, the Levites collected a tithe, and they are men who die. They're of mankind. The Levites were of mankind. They received a tithe. And in the other case, Melchizedek received a tithe from Abraham. It was received by him who is declared to be living. This is not talking about Jesus. It's very plainly talking about Melchizedek, because verse 6 is talking about the Levites and Melchizedek. So verse 8 is not talking about Christians giving tithes and Jesus receiving them in heaven. That's not what this is saying, because this is not talking about Jesus here when it says in the other case by him who is declared to be living. That's not talking about Jesus. It's just very plainly talking about Melchizedek. It tells us that in verse 6. And verse 7 is talking about Melchizedek blessing Abraham. So in the one case, the tenth is collected by men who died. That's the Levitical priesthood. In the other case, Melchizedek, who is declared to be living, he received the tithe from Abraham. So verse 9, one might even say that Levi, who collects the tenth, paid the tenth through Abraham. To who? To Melchizedek. And it wasn't a tenth of everything Abraham had, it was a tenth of the spoils. Because when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestors. So here we see that Melchizedek was a priest of the Most High God. Abraham gave him an offering, a one-time offering of a tenth of the spoils that he won by defeating Chedorlaomer. And we see that Melchizedek was the priest of the Most High God at the time Abraham gave that offering. Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek and not of the order of Levi. The Levites received a tithe of everything that Israel had. A tenth of everything the Israelites had went to the Levites. Abraham never gave anything he had to Melchizedek. He paid a tenth of the spoils of war to Melchizedek. Verse 11, for if perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it the law was given to the people, why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek and not in the order of Aaron? So notice that Jesus is not in the order of Aaron. He's not of the Levitical priesthood. He's of the order of Melchizedek. For when there is a change of the priesthood, there must also be a change of the law. We saw that in chapter 8, verse 13, we see that the law is obsolete. The old covenant is obsolete. The old covenant is in the law. Because in verse 11, it said, for on the basis of the priesthood, the law was given to the people. In other words, it was part of the old covenant. The law was part of the old covenant. Verse 13, he of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar. So here we see that Jesus Christ, who's of the order of Melchizedek, he was of Judah. And it is never spoken that anyone of the tribe of Judah should serve at the altar. That's because the Levitical priesthood was a copy of the real altar in heaven, the real temple, the real tabernacle in heaven. The Levites were a priesthood to that copy of the real things. Jesus is of the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a priest of the actual temple in heaven. Verse 14, for it is clear that our Lord Jesus descended from Judah, and in regard to that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. In other words, Jesus' priesthood has nothing to do with the Levitical priesthood. Verse 15, and what we have said is even more clear if another priest like Melchizedek appears. In other words, Jesus is like Melchizedek. He's of his order. One who has become a priest not on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, in other words, not because he's a Levite, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. Now we know that Jesus lives on forever, and we saw that Melchizedek is without end of days. He lives forever. Melchizedek lives forever, and Jesus lives forever. Jesus is of the order of Melchizedek. Verse 17, for it is declared you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Like we read in Psalm 110, Jesus is of the order of Melchizedek. Verse 18, the former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless. That's the law. The former regulation is the law that was part of the old covenant. The law was set aside because it was weak and useless. For the law made nothing perfect. Verse 19 tells us the law made nothing perfect. And a better hope is introduced, by which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath. Others became priests without any oath. But Jesus became a priest with an oath when God said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. That's Psalm 110. But of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. So here we see why the old covenant is obsolete and we're living under the new covenant, because Jesus is of the order of Melchizedek, and Jesus is the guarantee of the better covenant. He is the priest in the order of Melchizedek. Verse 23, now there have been many of those priests since the death prevented them from continuing in office. In other words, in the Levitical priesthood, there were many priests because they died. But verse 24, but because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. So just like Melchizedek is a priest forever, we see that Jesus is a priest forever. He has a permanent priesthood. So he's of the order of Melchizedek before the actual temple in heaven. Verse 25, therefore he's able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. Such a priest meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Those things are not true of the Levitical priesthood. They're true of Jesus. Jesus is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Verse 27, unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as priests men who are weak, but the oath which came after the law appointed the Son who has been made perfect forever. And he's of the order of Melchizedek. So that's how we get to chapter 8, where it points out that Jesus is before the real sanctuary. Chapter 8, verse 1. The point of what we're saying is this: we do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord and not by man. And then it makes it clear that this temple is in heaven. It says in verse 4, if he were on earth, in other words, Jesus isn't on earth, he's at the right hand of the Father. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already men who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. And once again, Hebrews was written while the temple was still in operation. The temple was still in existence. Hebrews was written before 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. There were still Levitical priests offering the gifts prescribed by the law when this book was written. Verse 5, they serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of that which is in heaven. So we can see here that Jesus is a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. He's not of the Levitical priesthood. He is a high priest who lives forever. And he meets the needs of mankind because he actually took on flesh and blood. He can actually relate to our weaknesses because he went through all of them. He actually bore the body of a man. He lived as a man. And he died on the cross for us and took all of our sins. And Jesus was the great high priest of our profession. And since we have such a great high priest who's gone into the heavens, Jesus is the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession, like it says in Hebrews 4:14. Hold fast our profession of our faith in Jesus Christ, because he is the great high priest. He's of the order of Melchizedek and not of the order of Levi. He's not a Levitical priest. He's a priest in the order of Melchizedek. He lives forever, just like Melchizedek lives forever. So that's my message for today. Thanks for watching.